So a few days ago, I found this video where someone climbed from Moss Grotto to the cradle in Silksong without touching the ground. Now in this video, they were in Act 2, but that made me wonder, could you do this with Act 3? And instead of stopping at the cradle, I wanted to go all the way to the surface, where some parts of the game expect you to have a silk sword. But before I begin, I have to explain some rules. I don't count transitioning into a room, swimming, or grabbing onto a ledge as touching the ground. All abilities and shortcuts will be available to me. I cannot use any major glitches, but I will be splicing the video a lot because some tags are barely humanly possible. I will be using the Architect's Crest, although I accidentally started with the Hunter, but either way, the process is the same. So now let's begin. On the right side is a scale of how hard I found each room to be. Now this is a starting area, so thankfully most of these rooms are pretty easy. However, immediately we're met with a pretty long room, which isn't necessarily hard, but more so annoying. You'll also notice that the most helpful skills that I'll use almost all the time are the double jump, the float, and the harpoon, although you'll need to cling to a wall in order to refresh your double jump. Here we can use the walls to climb up and skip most of the moss grotto. Once we reach bone bottom, we'll notice that all the buildings are destroyed, but we can use these snitch flies to pogo off of and restore our double jump and dash. This room is not super difficult, but it's a little bit annoying and kind of long since we have to climb up all the way with these small ledges and a few enemies to pogo off of. Our goal is to reach the citadel through blasted steps, which we'll do by going through Shellwood, but to get to Shellwood we would first have to go to the top of the Marrow. So far, all of these beginning areas are pretty easy to do, since they were designed for minimal abilities. Here I can use the bell beast to get across. Now the harpoon actually has a small cooldown, but I can actually use the plasmium file tool to stall in the air, which gives you enough time to use the harpoon immediately after. The only problem is that you can only use 6 of them before you have to reset them at a bench, which we're not allowed to do, so I'll keep a counter at the top right to see how many tools we use. We are now near the top of the Marrow, and we can enter Shellwood using the shortcut on the left. This room is pretty much completely free, as it's all vertical and you can use a lot of wall climbs to get around the place, and also with a few pogos you can reach the top with no worries. It's pretty much the same thing as here, except there's now a few enemies that you have to take care of along the way, or you can just completely avoid them. At the top, we can go over to the left where we head towards the Bellevue station, which connects directly into blasted steps. After a few more flat horizontal rooms of pretty much nothing to worry about, we finally enter our first challenge, the entrance to blasted steps. And this is what it looks like. One giant long horizontal room with absolutely no walls to cling to except for that little gap there. And all the way at the end, you have to cling to this wall right here. And since the game forces you to use your double jump before you can use your float, it's pretty much impossible that we get here. But our secret weapon actually lies in that. Because during testing, I actually found out that you can pogo these boulders while they're falling down. And with a few harpoons, and with a few plasmium stalls, you're able to safely get across just barely in time, completing our first real challenge in the run. Surprisingly, that's our only major problem before reaching the top of the coral chambers, although we still use some plasmium stalls like in this room. But the rest is pretty easy, especially with our double jump. In this area, we can actually use the wall on the right to boost ourselves upwards and skip most of the parkour that's on the left side. Continuing going up this wall, we can head over here and pogo off this judge and then continue to head on to the right. Heading on to the next room, which is basically all upwards movement, which we can quickly get across by using our double jumps and wall climbs. Having double jump also allows us to easily breeze past this room, as well as using our claw line to get across the long horizontal areas. This brings us all the way to the last judge hall, which we can quickly get across. And finally, the grand gate, which is basically the same idea. And at last, we are finally inside the citadel. To actually enter the main area of the citadel, we can climb these scales, which I kind of struggle to do, but eventually we can make it over to this little secret area on the top right. This next room is pretty narrow, but it's pretty short, so with a bit of precision, it's not that bad at all. Although I did find it a little bit finicky to get to the top right here. And now we're faced with the main part of the citadel, where we first encounter this pretty large room and need to hit some enemies to get across. Then comes these small tunnels that are a little bit tricky to get through, and ends off with a jump that's a little bit tight. The path on the right here is actually really hard, so I decided to take this path, but I had to use 2 plasmium to stall. In the next room, we can use the secret shortcut that's here in the top left, which is the only reason why we can take this path. This room has a few enemies that we can use, but we still have to use our plasmium to stall in this long, narrow hallway, which does bring our plasmium count up to 8. With that being said, we are also about halfway into the citadel. Next up is another tall room where the main problem comes from avoiding these enemies. We can then avoid this platforming section by poking onto these spikes over here. Then comes another annoying narrow hallway, but thankfully it's not that long, so we get through pretty easily. Here's another vertical room which can use the same strategy of pogoing onto the spikes to get up to the next room, which puts us into the final stretch of the Choral chamber, which we can easily glide across, putting us into the Cog Dancer's room. But very soon, we will be approaching a major problem. Unfortunately, in the next room, we have to go into this hole in the ceiling, which is a bit too far for us to reach, which is why we have to touch the ground and use our silk sword to get up there. Meaning for the first time in this run, we will have to add one floor touch into our count. Or do we? Let's rewind and allow me to introduce this speedrun strat. This is called the Voltpogo. If you use the Volt vessels in bola form, they will split into two balls, which you can then use the Delver's drill to pogo off of, giving you extra height, allowing us to reach the opening without touching the ground. But this means that our total count of tools is 3, which is why we have to use the Architect's crest, as it is the only crest that has 3 red tool slots. This next room is a very long vertical passage which is pretty hard, especially due to narrow passages like this. Mess up the timing and you'll fail. A lot of the walls are not even climbable, which makes it even harder. And we're only about halfway there. And what's even worse is that this area expects you to have the silk sword to climb up there. But we can actually skip that by doing a precise double jump. But probably the hardest part of this room is this next section, because you have to do this very tight jump and dash into this passage. Because if your harpoon doesn't stick onto the wall, you will fall down and touch the ground. Now dodging through the steam, we can go and harpoon across this hole, which brings us very close to the end. And with a few more jumps, we're finally out onto the next room. We're now in the large area of the Cogwork court, which we can quickly get across by pogoing these gears to reset our dash and double jump. Although we do face a little problem with this area, where the hole is just a bit too high, but thankfully the Architect's crest has a very long pogo, allowing us barely to reach the top. Now this room expects to use the silk sword, but we can now use our secret Voltpogo technique to scale this unclimbable wall. Now thankfully you are able to grab onto this ledge over here, which makes things a lot easier. From here on we can do a few more pogos and reach the top with no problem. Although the room is not quite finished yet, as we have to make our way over here onto the top, come over to the left side and make it down all the way to the left while stalling above the floor. And finally we are inside the cradle. And now you'll notice that I have hitboxes turned on, and that is because we have to use the Voltpogo again. But unfortunately we can't just do it on this left side because this slope actually doesn't break the balls. The right side is also a little bit better, but eventually if you get too high, it also just slides off the slope. But thankfully Team Cherry is nice enough to give us this corner up here that actually does break the balls, right under the exit. Meaning with a bit of precision, we can climb this wall on the right, boost ourselves upwards, then swing over to the left side and just barely reach this corner, perform a few more Voltpogos, and we can finally reach the top, at the cost of using 4 Volt vessels. And thankfully this next room is pretty straightforward and we don't have to use any secret tech to get across. But of course all good things must eventually come to an end because we reached this room, which starts off as a typical vertical climbing section, where I then proceed to fail this jump 2 times in a row and eventually get on the 3rd. But now we can use these spikes to pogo off of and to get a little bit of higher ground, then perform 2 Volt pogos to get to this ledge here. But that's not it, because I have to swing over here and do not 1, not 2, not 3, 4, or 5, but 6 Voltpogos. Because despite this section being flat, it's actually not climbable. But even after all of that, we have to add 1 floor touch count because Hornet has to touch the ground to transition into this cave. Now we're in the border caves, and with 1 plasmium we can get across. Now you might think I can reach the shortcut above, but that also requires touching the ground for another room transition, so I will have to take the hard way out, meaning doing the entire surface parkour without touching the ground. Which honestly isn't too much different from the original route, since most of the time you're clinging to walls or pogoing onto enemies and balls. Now if you're paying attention, you actually realize that we overuse our tools, and our plasmiums and our Volt vessels are both actually more than that maximum amount. But don't worry, I will explain that later on. But first let's just finish this section, because we are actually at the last part of this parkour, where we can finally see the surface light shining down on us. And after everything we've been through, we can finally touch the surface. And just for fun, I decided to go all the way to the left bound of the surface, since I'm able to do it without touching the ground either. And once we reach the end, Hornet realizes her silliness and decides to finally walk on the ground once again. And now we can say we finally reached the peak. Oh yeah, wait, we still have to finish the tool problem, right? So remember what I said, since the game forces you to use your double jump before you can use your float, turns out I'm just completely wrong, because I discovered that buffering your jump during your claw line actually makes you float instead of jump, which gives us the ability to stall in the air and then save our jump for later. so we can use this instead of plasmium stalls. So now we can go back to see how many tools we can actually save. And this first room we can actually do completely normally. The blasted steps entrance is also a little bit trickier, as I also found out that the architect crest cannot pogo onto the rock, which is why I have to damage tank them instead, which gives us that little vertical boost, allowing us to skip 2 plasmiums. Turns out I don't even have to use this tech for this next room because I can just dash and immediately harpoon to get across. Same thing with this room, where I just had to space out my double jump and my dash, which gets me in range with the harpoon. This room actually became a lot easier than before, as the float is actually a lot more lenient than the plasmium stalling, and also saves us 2 tool uses. Floating in this vent also saves us another plasmium stall, meaning there's one final one that can actually be saved in the border caves. So it turns out we didn't have to use a single plasmium at all. But now we should talk about the Volt vessels. Unfortunately, we can't reach this one even with the Beast Boost tech, so we'll have to use a Voltpogo. With a little bit of precision, you actually do this in 1 Voltpogo instead of 2. In the lace room, you can just barely get it with 3 instead of 4, so we can subtract another one. But unfortunately, that's it. Those 2 rooms were the only ones I managed to shorten it down, but every other room seemed to be already optimized though. And that's mostly because the last room by itself needs 8 Voltpogos. And since the maximum amount we were allowed to have is 10, it seemed like it was impossible. Until I realized that you could use the reserve bind tool and the architect's craft bind to refill all of your tools. So we can actually use 20 volt vessels instead of just 10. So in fact, I didn't even have to optimize any of those things. With that being cleared, we can now confirm that you could go from the starting area all the way to the peak of the Silksong map with only 1 floor touch, which is this stupid transition. Oh, and also while editing this video, Team Cherry actually patched Voltpogos. So if you're on a console, you can't do any of that. But anyways, that's it. Thank you guys for watching. Fun fact, only 1.9% of players have the hardest achievement in Silksong, which is somehow higher than the 1.6% of people who are subscribed to me. So make sure to subscribe so that you are statistically better than the people who have completed this achievement. Behind me is Act 3's fastest rosary farm, which you can check out over here. YouTube thinks that you'll like this video. Give me video ideas and Discord link in description. Bye bye.